Stuka Joe here. Today we're going to take a look at this game, Tank Clash, a game designed by Lim Ming Liang and to be published by Amoeba Games through a Kickstarter campaign that begins on November the 22nd. Tank Clash is a casual, easy-to-learn two-player World War II tank versus tank combat game. It is what we call a filler game, a light game which is perfect for playing at the end of a long wargaming convention or to bring non-war gamers into the hobby. The game includes 4 terrain boards, 24 armor tokens, 6 mission cards, 14 damage tokens, 12 tactical cards, 6 checkpoint tokens, 12 morale cards, 2 ace tokens, 10 tank tokens, 6 acrylic dice, and 1 insignia token. There are 3 types of mission cards, and in this game each player draws a mission card and keeps it secret, and the mission card will dictate the player's strategy, and players may have the same mission card. Players can also win the game by reaching one of these 3 goals: capturing an enemy base, destroying all enemy tanks, or fulfilling, of course, their secret mission. Players can also choose before play that victory be determined by victory points. We start by flipping the double-sided insignia token to determine who will be the first player. The morale cards are shuffled and a morale card deck is formed. Each player is dealt 1 of each type of tactical card, which they place face up on the table. We set up the terrain with the 4-piece terrain boards, and each player will place 2 boards as his territory. The boards are modular, so they can be combined in different ways. Here we see the boards arranged in a narrow area. Here the boards form a wide area, and here we see a staggered way of setting up the boards. Each player places a checkpoint token on hex rows 1, 4, and 7 of their side of the board, and they must be placed in open spaces. That is, not inside obstacles like buildings or forests. And note that half hexes are treated as full hexes when counting placement. The checkpoint token on row 1 is that side's base camp, while those on rows 4 and 7 are checkpoints. Next, players take turns placing their 5 tanks. There's 3 medium, 1 heavy, and 1 tank destroyer per side. The starting player places the first tank, followed by the second player until all 10 tanks are placed on the board. And tanks are set up as follows. Armor tokens are placed underneath a tank's counter according to the tank's armor rating. For example, the Sherman tank has 2 armor tokens. Each player assigns a tank ace to any of their tanks by placing the ace token underneath the selected tank counter. During his turn, a player can take 2 actions, and he may perform the actions using either 1 or 2 tanks. The player may move 1 tank and then move a second tank. He may fire with 1 tank and then fire with a second tank. Or he may move 1 tank and fire with a second tank. Or he may attack with 1 tank and then move with the other tank. What a player cannot do during his turn is to move 1 tank twice or fire the same tank twice. Players may move their tanks up to the maximum distance stated in the stat sheets during their turn. For example, the Sherman's tank speed is 3, so it can move up to 3 hexes. There are 4 different types of terrain in the game, and these may affect a tank's movement and attack. Flat terrain like grass, sand, and rocks has no effect on movement, Each hex costs 1 movement point to enter, and the terrain has no effect on attack. Tanks cannot enter river hexes, but they may fire across them. Forest hexes are denoted by having a yellow outline, and movement of a tank in a forest hex is reduced to just 1 forest hex per turn, regardless of the tank's speed. Forest hexes provide concealment for tanks that are in them. If a tank is in a forest hex, an enemy tank has to be within 2 hexes to be able to spot and fire at the concealed tank. However, a tank in a forest hex can spot and shoot at any enemy tank within range, as it normally would. This example, the Tiger tank below, can spot and shoot at the Pershing tank that is 3 hexes away. The Pershing tank, however, has to close in to just 2 hexes in order to spot and shoot at the concealed Tiger tank. 2 tanks in forest hexes need to be adjacent to each other in order to fire at one another. Both tanks may only move 1 hex at a time until they are out of the forest and in the open again. When setting up the game, players place 3 checkpoint tokens on their side of the board. The checkpoint on row 1 is that player's base camp, and the other 2 are checkpoints. A player that captures an enemy checkpoint flips the token to his side and draws 1 morale card from the deck. Players can repair their damaged tank. This is done by removing damage tokens. This can be done at their respective checkpoints. Players cannot replenish their armor tokens at checkpoints. A player that occupies a checkpoint also has a defender advantage. That is, the attacker subtracts 1 from all dice rolled in an attack. A player that occupies a checkpoint and suffers a hit on his tank has to move out of the checkpoint and back in again in order to repair the damage. Checkpoints in this game can be captured, lost, and recaptured again any number of times. Opposing tanks can attack one another once they are within range, and a tank's range is indicated by its firepower strength in the stats sheets. And firepower in this game is equal to attack range as well as the number of dice that the tank will roll. Each player can take 2 actions during his turn. A player can either attack with 1 tank and attack with a second tank, move 1 tank and then move a second tank, or move an attack or vice versa with 1 tank. In this example, the Sherman tank moves within 2 hexes during its first action so that it can attack the Marder tank during its second action. And the Sherman's tank attack strength is 2 dice, and the range of its attack is also 2 hexes. And note that a tank cannot attack an enemy that is hiding behind tall or solid obstacles like forests or buildings. In this example, during the first action, the Sherman tank moves within its attack range of 2 hexes to the Marder tank. In the second action, the Sherman tank fires at the Marder tank. Besides being in range, opposing tanks also need to have a line of sight to attack one another. And the line of sight rules in this game are simple. Only direct barriers, like buildings or forests, can obstruct 2 opposing tanks. To destroy a tank, all of the tank's armor tokens must be removed, and then the tank takes 1 more hit. To attack, a player rolls a number of dice equal to the firepower of his attacking tank and chooses the die with the highest value. Let's take a look at the possible results. A die roll of 1 is a miss with no effect. A roll of 2 is a scare result, and the defending tank is retreated 1 hex by the attacking player. A roll of 3 is a light damage result, and the defending tank takes 1 damage token. A roll of 4 is heavy damage, and the defending tank receives 2 damage tokens. A roll of 5 is a hit, which removes 1 armor token from the defending tank. And a roll of 6 is a critical hit, which not only removes 1 armor token from the target tank, but the attacker also takes the top card from the morale deck. Now we'll play a full game, but using the victory point conditions to determine who wins the game. Now this game includes these mission cards, which if you're playing with them, you randomly draw a card and secretly inspect it, and that's your top secret mission. If you accomplish it, you win the game. But because we're going to play solo, we're going to use the alternate method of determining victory, and that is through victory points. The first player that reaches 5 victory points wins the game, and victory points are awarded by destroying tanks. 2 points for the heavy tank if it's destroyed, 1 point each for a tank destroyer or a medium tank destroyed. If the ace is killed, you win a point, and if you capture an enemy checkpoint, it is 2 points, and finally 2 points if you move 3 tanks into enemy territory. So what is enemy territory? These 2 boards are American territory, so the Germans would have to advance 3 tanks there to score those 2 victory points. And conversely, the Americans would have to advance 3 tanks in any of these 2 boards. So we start by flipping the insignia token to see who the first player to set up and move will be. And it will be the Americans. So the Americans place their base camp on row number 1. And the Germans also place their base camp on their row number 1. The Americans place their checkpoint that goes in row number 4. And the Germans place their row number 4 checkpoint. And remember that we count partial hexes to determine the positioning of the checkpoint. The Americans place their checkpoint that goes in row 7. And finally, the Germans place their row 7 checkpoint. Now we place the tanks. The first player is the American player, but let's assign the tank ace to one of our tanks. We will roll 1d6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and if it's a 6, we'll roll again. So the roll is a 1, and the tank ace will be placed underneath this Sherman tank. Now we do the same for the Germans. The roll is a 3, so the German ace will go to one of the Panzer IVs. So now we place the tanks. The American is the first player, so he places 1 tank on any of his 2 boards. And he places a Sherman tank 2 hexes away from the bridge. The Germans place a Panzer tank on the woods near the bridge on their side of the map. Americans place their Hellcat on the woods directly opposite to the Panzer IV that were just placed. Germans place another Panzer IV near the bridge. That's the closest they can place it on their board. They can't place it in any of those half hexes because the other half is American territory. Americans place another Sherman, this time on the bridge. Germans place their Marder tank in the woods 4 hexes away from the Sherman on the bridge, so the Marder has that Sherman within range. Americans place their Pershing tank on the other side of the river 3 hexes away from the Panzer tank closest to the bridge. Germans place their last Panzer tank 4 hexes away, that is out of range of the Pershing tank. The Americans place their last Sherman tank in the open, relatively near the bridge, and this particular Pershing tank is the one that has the American ace. The Germans place their last tank, their Tiger tank, behind the woods in a central reserve position. The Americans go first because they won the toss of the insignia token. The Americans play their artillery support card, and these tactical cards you can play 1 per turn, but once they are played, they are flipped to their back sides, and you cannot use them again in the whole game. This card will eliminate an armor token from the tank that is in the central position and will cause 1 damage to any tank in its surrounding hexes. The Americans target that Panzer tank closest to the bridge, so that Panzer tank loses 1 of its 2 armor tokens. And there's no other tank adjacent to that hex, so no other tank is affected. Next, the Americans can now activate 1 or 2 tanks. There is no tank that can fire at the just hit Panzer tank, so the Americans have to move 1 tank within range to fire. So what the Americans will do is that they will move the Sherman tank 1 hex forward, and now the Panzer tank is within its range. And the Sherman tank now fires at the Panzer tank. Note that the Sherman tank has a firepower of 2, meaning that it rolls 2 dice and selects the highest roll. So the Americans roll 2 dice, and it's snake eyes. So that's a miss on both counts. So the American attack fails completely, and now it's the Germans' turn. The Germans play their artillery support card against the Sherman on the bridge. The Sherman loses 1 of its 2 armor tokens. Next, the Germans fire with the Marder at the Sherman on the bridge. The Marder rolls a 6, a critical hit, and that removes the last armor token on the Sherman. The Sherman takes 1 more hit, it will be destroyed. And the Germans get to select the topmost card from the morale deck, and that's the Demolish card. And that allows them to try to remove an armor token from an enemy tank if they roll an even result with 1d6. Germans save this card for future use. Now the Panzer fires at the Sherman, and it rolls a 5. That's a hit, and that destroys the American tank. The Germans destroy 1 medium tank, so they have 1 victory point. Now it's the Americans' turn. Pershing fires at the Panzer tank near the bridge and scores a critical hit, removing the last armor token of that tank. Critical hit allows the Americans to draw a card from the morale deck, and it is an experience card that allows them to re-roll 1 die in 1 attack. The Americans save the card for now. Their second move, the Americans move the Pershing tank towards the bridge. Now it's the Germans' turn. Germans play the Demolish card to attempt to remove an armor token from the Hellcat, and they have to roll an even number. But the roll is a 3, and the attempt fails. And that uses up that card. Germans still have their 2 actions. Germans move the weakened Panzer out of harm's way to deny the Americans an easy point. And the Tiger advances into the woods. Now it's the Americans' turn. Germans have their tanks lined up perfect for an air support attack. So the Americans begin their turn by playing the air support attack. And as shown in the diagram, the tank in the selected hex will lose an armor token, and the tanks in the white hexes will suffer 1 damage point. The Tiger loses an armor token, and the other 2 tanks each suffer 1 damage point, a devastating aerial attack. So the Pershing advances and crosses the bridge, followed by 1 of the Shermans, but not too close to be a target for German air support. It's the Germans' turn. Notice that the Marder has a shot at the Pershing, but the Pershing cannot fire at the Marder because the Marder is concealed in the forests. So he still has to close in to fire at the German tank. Marder fires at the Pershing. The best result is a 4. Heavy damage, 2 damage points. Germans now, for their second move, they move the Marder back. Now the Pershing won't have a line of sight to the Marder even if it closes into 2 hexes. It's the Americans' turn, and they want to cross into German territory with 3 tanks. Pershing moves 2 hexes and tries to stay out of range of the Marder. Notice that the Marder right now doesn't have a line of sight to the Pershing because the Tiger is blocking it. Now the Sherman tank moves 3 hexes and crosses the bridge. The Americans play their smoke card now, and the Germans won't be able to attack for 1 full turn. The Germans cannot attack in this turn with any of their tanks, and the way I interpret the rules is they cannot attack also with their air support card. So the German player will try to clear the line of sight of the Marder, and does so by moving the Tiger tank into the woods as its first move. And the Panzer tank at the top moves back into the woods to stay out of range of the Pershing. So that's the end of the German turn. The smoke is now gone. Now it's the Americans' turn. So the Pershing moves towards the checkpoint that is in row 7 to try to spread out the German defenses. And the Sherman tank fires at the Tiger, and the Sherman scores a critical hit. And the Tiger loses its last armor token. The Americans gain another morale card. This time it's a reinforce card. And they still have 2 morale cards that they haven't used. It's the Germans' turn, and they have to take care of that threat and deal with those 2 American tanks before more start crossing the bridge. Before moving or firing with a tank, the Germans play their repair tactical card. This allows them to add a lost armor token to one of their tanks, and they add 1 to their Tiger tank. Next, the Germans move the Marder tank to a forest space from which it now, in its second action, fires at the Pershing. Marder scores a hit which removes an armor token from the Pershing. It still has 2 left, and the 2 damage points. On to the American turn. Pershing fires. Heavy damage, 2 damage points. The German tank already has 1, so now it is destroyed. And the Americans now have 1 victory point. Second move, the Pershing moves towards the checkpoint. That will force the hand of the Panzer IV to have to move into the checkpoint. It's the Germans' turn, and they have to protect that checkpoint. And the Pershing tank has 2 armor tokens left, so it needs 3 hits to be destroyed. Germans can use their air support card, and they could use their 2 actions to fire the Marder and also to fire the Panzer that is next to the checkpoint. This Panzer has the German tank ace. That adds 1 to the die roll, so has very good chance hitting. So the Germans play their air support card, and the Pershing loses 1 of its 2 armor tokens. Marder fires and obtains a critical hit, and the Pershing loses its last armor token. Germans receive a morale card, Sniper, and this adds 1 to the highest die rolled. And this card may be used very soon. Now, the Germans will fire with the Panzer tank, and this is the tank that has the German tank ace. The Panzer only rolls 2 dice, but the tank ace adds 1 to each of the dice rolled. The Germans don't want to take any chances, so they play their Sniper card, which adds 1 to the highest die rolled, and this card has to be played before rolling the dice. The Panzer rolls a 6, a critical hit, no need for the ace ability or the Sniper card, and the Pershing is destroyed. Germans take another morale card, Ambush. This allows a defender to attack during the opponent player's turn. The Pershing is worth 2 victory points, and now the Germans have 3, and they need 2 more to win. It's the American player's turn, and notice that if the Germans enforce the line that divides the board as shown here, they will earn the 2 victory points that they need, so the Americans have to stop that advance, and that Sherman tank looks very exposed. So the Americans move the Hellcat onto the bridge in order to be able to fire at any advancing Germans, and they also advance the Sherman that is in the woods to provide some cover. The American tank that is in the forward position is the one that has the American tank ace. And this is bad news for the Americans. If they lose the tank and the ace, that will provide the last 2 victory points that the Germans need to win the game. That Sherman has 2 armor tokens, so it needs to receive 3 hits to be destroyed. In the first action, the Tiger tank obtains a critical hit, and the Sherman loses one of its 2 armor tokens. Germans receive yet another morale card. Sabotage. Add a flame token to any enemy tank. The Marder fires, rolling a 5, a hit. And the Sherman loses its last armor token. Now it's the American player's turn. The American player starts by playing the Repair tactical card. This allows the lead Sherman to recover 1 damage token. Americans decide to make a run at it, and they advance the lead Sherman tank and the Hellcat in the direction of the German checkpoint in row 7. It's the Germans' turn. They have 3 victory points. They need 2 to win. If they destroy the Hellcat, it is 1, but they need 2 hits to destroy the Hellcat, so they would need both actions to be firing actions that would leave this Panzer tank unavailable to secure the checkpoint. So the Germans make their first move by moving the Panzer tank onto the checkpoint in row 7. And the German Tiger fires at the Hellcat and causes a hit, so the Hellcat has no more armor tokens. Now it's the Americans' turn. They play their Mines tactical card, and this adds 2 damage tokens to any German tank. Marder already has 1, and when we add 2, this is equal to the Marder losing its sole damage token. So now the Hellcat fires at the Marder. Now the Germans play the Ambush morale card, and that causes now the defender, the Marder, to attack the Hellcat instead. Marder fires and rolls a 5, a hit, and destroys the Hellcat. With the destruction of the Hellcat, the Germans are just 1 point away from winning the game. Americans still have 1 move left in this turn. Sherman now will fire at the Marder, and the American player announces that he will use the experience card to re-roll a die for attack. Sherman only rolls 2 dice. And this is the Sherman tank with the American ace, so it adds 1 to each of the dice rolled. The high die, the 5, is modified to a 6, so this is a critical hit, and the Marder is destroyed. Now the American victory point score increases. It's the Germans' turn, and if they destroy any of the Sherman tanks, they will win. And the Sherman tank that is near the German checkpoint seems very isolated and the target of many upcoming German attacks. And the first move is for the Panzer to seal off the bridge from the second Sherman tank. The Tiger fires at the Sherman, and the result is a 2, and the Germans retreat the Sherman 1 hex towards the river. We go to the Americans' turn. Americans begin by playing their infantry support card, and this adds 1 die to any attack. Sherman fires at the Panzer, and the Sherman obtains a hit against the Panzer on the bridge, and the Panzer loses 1 of its 2 armor tokens. Next, the American tank ace in the Sherman now conducts a bold move. maneuvering the Sherman tank between both German tanks, and now none of them have a line of sight to the American tank. Now it's the Germans' turn. The Germans' first action, the Tiger tank moves adjacent to the Sherman tank. Tiger fire and causes heavy damage. 2 damage tokens are added to the Sherman tank. Notice that the Sherman tank has 1 armor token. That's the German turn, and now the Americans make a run to the other German checkpoints which are unguarded. Now the Sherman tank with the American ace is out of range of the Tiger and Panzer tanks. In a less than chivalrous move, the other Sherman tank now moves away to prevent being the source of the victory point needed by the Germans. Now it's the Germans' turn. They cannot allow that Sherman tank to capture both checkpoints, the one in row 4 and the base which is in row 1. Capture of these 2 checkpoints will give the Americans 6 victory points and the game. So the Germans begin their turn by playing their Mines morale card. The Mines card adds 2 more damage markers to the Sherman, and now it has 4. And the end result is that the Sherman loses its last armor token. Now the Germans have their 2 moves. Tiger tank moves in for the kill. The roll is a 6, a critical hit, and the Sherman tank with its ace are destroyed, and that's the end of the game. And by taking out the Sherman tank and the ace, the Germans now achieve 6 victory points. That's the end of our game here of Tank Clash. We used the narrow map board. There's other map board configurations. And of course, there's other ways of determining victory instead of victory points. And those are with these cards, which in my opinion is better for, of course, a face-to-face play because it's a secret mission. Makes the game very interesting. But if you're playing by yourself, I think the way to go is to use the victory point method. So this is Tank Clash, a game designed by Lim Ming Liang and to be published by Amoeba Games through a Kickstarter campaign that starts on November 22nd, and I'll leave a link to the Kickstarter in the description below. Now this is a casual World War II tank battle game. It is not a simulation, but it has many concepts that appear in wargaming. For example, the use of hexes. You have also movement allowances, firepower ratings, ranges, line of sight. So it can serve as a game that can be a bridge for someone who's not a wargamer to get their feet wet with many familiar wargaming concepts. And it is a fast-playing game, a very portable game. It can be a filler after a long convention day. So, Tank Clash, Western Front. I hope that this video has given you a good idea of the flow of the game and what the game has to offer. This is Stuka Joe, signing off for now. Thanks for watching.